Welcome, dear dreamer, to your peaceful escape, a place where stories come alive softly and gently, guiding your mind to rest and your heart to wander. Tonight, we journey into the life of a man whose story still echoes through time, a legend not just of great deeds, but of deep reflection and timeless wisdom. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe and tap the bell so you never miss a moment of calm inspiration designed to help you unwind and drift into a restful sleep. And if this story touches your soul or sparks your curiosity, please leave a comment below. Your thoughts and dreams are always welcome here. Now, settle in, breathe deeply, and let the story of Alexander the Great's inner journey carry you toward a peaceful night. Long before the name Alexander was uttered with reverence and awe, before statues were carved in his honor, before empires trembled at his footsteps, and before myths began to form around his shadow, there was simply a boy who ran through the marble corridors of a palace in Pella, the ancient capital of Macedon. A boy born not into simplicity, but into pressure, into prophecy, and into a world that expected greatness before he even knew what greatness was. Alexander was born in July of 356 BCE under the sign of the lion, or so the astrologers said. On the night of his birth, lightning struck the temple of Artemis at Ephesus, and the priests whispered that it was a sign. Some said it was a warning. Others claimed it was a divine omen. The gods had sent a soul that would not merely walk the earth, but leave footprints upon its mountains, rivers, and the hearts of men. His mother, Olympias, was no ordinary woman. She was a Molossian princess of Epirus, a land of deep mysticism, known for serpent worship and ancient rites. Her eyes glowed with fierce ambition. Her voice carried the fire of prophecy, and her belief in her son was less of maternal hope and more of divine certainty. She didn't just raise Alexander, she forged him, like a blacksmith hammering a blade under celestial fire. From his earliest days, Alexander was told he was different. Not merely a prince, not just the son of Philip II, the proud king who had united a warlike people under one banner, but the son of destiny. Olympias whispered stories of Achilles into his ears at night. She told him that he descended from Heracles on his father's side, and from Aeacus, grandfather of Achilles, on hers. But more than blood, she insisted, was belief. The belief that the gods had breathed something exceptional into him. She didn't let him forget it, not even for a moment. Yet, what does this do to a child? Imagine being told from the age of 3 that you were born to change the world, that the stars blinked into alignment the moment you arrived, that the breath in your lungs came not only from your mother, but from the divine. This weight, this invisible crown, pressed upon Alexander's mind before he could pronounce the word king. He didn't play like other children. While others amused themselves with toys and laughter, Alexander found himself enthralled by stories, especially epic ones. The Iliad became his favorite. His eyes would shine at the deeds of Achilles, and often, late at night, he would ask his tutor to repeat the parts where the hero stood alone against the world. He wasn't drawn to conquest, at least not yet, but to meaning, to immortality, not of the body, but of the soul. He wanted to know what made a man worthy of remembrance. And beneath this yearning, perhaps there was a fear, one that he rarely admitted even to himself, the fear of being ordinary. His father, King Philip, was not a man to coddle dreams. He was pragmatic, shrewd, and forever skeptical. He saw the world through the eyes of a statesman and soldier. Power was built, not bestowed. It was calculated, not dreamed. To Philip, Alexander's intensity was ... odd, almost unnerving. He once said to a courtier, "My son dreams of becoming a god. I would settle for him becoming a good king." This clash between father and son defined much of Alexander's early pain. He adored his father's strength, but resented his cynicism. Philip was the lion of Macedon, but Alexander wanted to be the eagle above it. They clashed, often and fiercely. Philip would throw insults. Alexander would throw silence. The young prince could remain wordless for hours, then suddenly erupt into a poetic tirade. He was emotional, yes, but never aimless. Even his rage had focus. One story tells of Alexander refusing to speak to his father for weeks after a public insult. The entire palace held its breath during that silence. When they finally reconciled, Philip said, "You have the soul of your mother," and Alexander replied, "I have the fire of both of you, but I will use it differently." Despite this tension, Alexander admired his father's ambition. He watched closely as Philip transformed the Macedonian court from a rugged assembly of warriors into a cultured center of learning and diplomacy. Alexander listened to ambassadors with the curiosity of a scholar, even as a boy. He would ask them about the lands beyond their borders, about the customs, gods, and dreams of foreign people. While his peers boasted about spears and horses, Alexander spoke of wisdom, of truth, and of purpose. He was only 10 when he tamed the horse Bucephalus, a beast no man could approach. The court laughed as the young boy approached the wild animal, but Alexander noticed something the others didn't. The horse was afraid of its own shadow, so he turned it toward the sun, and with a calm voice and a steady hand, mounted it. The court gasped. His father wept. "O my son," he said, "seek a kingdom worthy of your greatness, for Macedon is too small for you." Alexander remembered those words. They both thrilled and haunted him. In truth, Alexander was already building a kingdom inside himself, one of discipline, intellect, and relentless curiosity. He woke before dawn. He read for hours. He asked questions that embarrassed his tutors. He trained not just his body, but his mind and soul. Every weakness he felt, he confronted. Every emotion he examined. He was becoming not a king, but a force. But he was also lonely. Greatness, even in its early stages, can be isolating. He would often retreat to the gardens behind the palace, staring at the sky for hours. One of his childhood friends, Hephaestion, once found him there and asked what he saw. "Possibility," Alexander replied, "and the burden of reaching it." He wasn't without friends, but few truly understood him. Many respected him, feared him, envied him, but only a handful loved him without condition. And that, for Alexander, was both his strength and his sorrow. He would grow into a man followed by thousands, yet often feel more alone than when he was that small boy in Pella, chasing shadows and omens. But there was one light that would soon enter his life, one mind that would match his, challenge him, and sharpen him into something extraordinary. Not a warrior, not a king, but a philosopher. His name was Aristotle. And with his arrival, Alexander's journey from boy to legend would begin in earnest, not with swords or crowns, but with questions. By the time Alexander turned 13, he had grown restless. The marble floors of the palace, the thundering hooves in the stables, and the echoing voices of courtiers no longer satisfied his hunger. He craved something else, a deeper understanding, not of tactics or territories, but of life, of truth, of the invisible architecture behind all things. And he was not alone in sensing this thirst. King Philip, despite his pragmatic nature, recognized that his son was no ordinary heir. While others measured their sons by how well they held a sword, Philip measured Alexander by the questions he asked when no one was watching. One night, after a long council meeting, Philip walked into his son's chamber and found the boy awake, reading. The lamp flickered as Alexander traced the lines of Homer's Iliad with quiet reverence. "You seek Achilles in those pages," Philip said. Alexander looked up, his eyes wide and glowing. "No," he replied softly. "I seek myself." It was then Philip made a decision that would change history, not through a treaty or battle, but through education. He summoned the man whose intellect already towered over much of Greece, a philosopher from Stagira, a former student of Plato, and a thinker whose mind could unravel the fabric of the universe, Aristotle. And so began one of the most extraordinary teacher-student relationships in human history. Aristotle did not arrive in royal garb. He came with scrolls, questions, and a gaze that pierced more than armor. When he first met Alexander, he didn't bow or flatter. He simply asked, "What is more valuable to a king, power, or wisdom?" Alexander blinked. "Power lets me rule others. Wisdom helps me rule myself." Aristotle smiled faintly. "Then let us begin with you." Their classroom was not confined to the palace walls. It was the fields, the groves, the mountain paths. It was the echo of a question whispered into the wind. It was a walk beside a river while discussing the nature of the soul. It was the stillness of a library where silence spoke louder than words. Aristotle didn't fill Alexander with facts. He unfolded his mind. He taught him logic, ethics, metaphysics, poetry, politics, biology, astronomy, and rhetoric. But more importantly, he taught him how to think, how to question, and how to see. He challenged Alexander's assumptions. When Alexander once said, "The gods favor the noble," Aristotle replied, "Do they favor them because they are noble, or are they called noble because the gods favor them?" That question haunted Alexander for years. He was particularly drawn to ethics. What made a man good? What made a ruler just? What made life meaningful? Aristotle explained the concept of eudaimonia, not mere happiness, but flourishing. A life lived in accordance with virtue, purpose, and excellence. That idea gripped Alexander's soul like nothing else had. Virtue, Aristotle said one day beneath the branches of a fig tree, is a habit, not a gift. You do not inherit it. You cultivate it daily, painfully, relentlessly. Alexander nodded. Like a sword must be forged. Exactly, said the philosopher. Even the sharpest iron begins as dull ore. And so Alexander took philosophy into his bones. He began to journal his thoughts, meditate beneath trees, and practice observing himself. If he felt pride, he questioned its source. If he felt anger, he traced its roots. He began to understand that ruling a kingdom meant little if he could not rule his own impulses. One of the most pivotal moments in their relationship occurred after a lesson on justice. Aristotle posed a thought experiment. Suppose you could do great things, build cities, free nations, inspire millions, but you had to tell a lie to do it. Would it be just? Alexander remained silent for a long time. Then he asked, if the lie gives birth to truth, was it ever a lie to begin with? Aristotle said nothing, only smiled. You will become dangerous, my boy. And Alexander did become dangerous, but not in the way his enemies feared. He became dangerous to limitation, to ignorance, to the smallness that so often traps men in the shallows of self-interest. He began to understand that legacy was not measured in years, but in impact, and impact was not always the result of force. It could also come through vision. At the heart of his education was one singular obsession: understanding humanity. Alexander devoured texts on the customs and philosophies of other cultures. He didn't just want to read about them, he wanted to experience them. He questioned merchants who came from Persia. He spoke with travelers from Egypt and the East. He memorized fragments of Eastern philosophies, seeking patterns in human thought across the world. Why do they believe different gods than we do? He asked Aristotle once. Because they see the divine through different mirrors, the teacher answered. But what if they are all looking at the same truth? Alexander asked. This question, more than any other, would later shape his destiny. It planted in him the radical idea that truth was not exclusive to one land, one people, or one tradition. That wisdom was not Greek or foreign, it was universal. The palace began to take notice of Alexander's transformation. Courtiers saw a boy who spoke like a man twice his age. Servants whispered that he conversed with philosophers as if born among the gods. Some feared he was becoming too abstract, too soft. But they did not see the inner discipline growing within him. Philosophy did not weaken Alexander. It gave him depth. He also began to value beauty in ways his father never did. He wrote poetry, appreciated music, and often wept when reading tragedy. He understood the fragility of life, the quickness with which time slipped away. He once said to Hephaestion, "We are but sparks in the dark. I want my spark to light the sky." But with growth came tension. As Alexander's mind expanded, so did his distance from Philip. The king saw the philosopher's influence as both a gift and a threat. He wanted a son ready for a throne, not a man lost in abstraction. He accused Aristotle of filling Alexander's head with illusions. "Will your riddles make him a ruler?" Philip asked one day. "They will make him a human first," Aristotle replied. The philosopher never bowed to power, and in doing so, he taught Alexander to think freely, even against the tide of authority. This tension reached a quiet climax when Philip remarried and threatened Alexander's position as heir. The young prince confronted his father at a feast, challenging him with words sharper than steel. Afterward, he fled the palace for months, seeking solace not in weapons, but in wisdom. He lived in the hills, read the stars, and spoke with wandering sages. And yet, something shifted during this time. The anger cooled, the ambition matured. When he returned, he was quieter, calmer, more resolute. He no longer needed to prove himself. He only needed to become himself. Aristotle knew his student's time with him was nearing its end. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, the old philosopher handed Alexander a scroll. "It is unfinished," he said. "What is it?" Alexander asked. "A treatise on the soul," Aristotle replied. "It is yours now. Finish it, not with ink, but with your life." Alexander clutched it silently. He understood. This was the true graduation, not a ceremony, but a departure. Not from learning, but from being a student. He would carry the lessons forward, not in words, but in the way he lived, ruled, and touched the world. As he left the quiet sanctuary of thought and returned to the storm of politics and succession, Alexander had changed. He had walked beside a mind that had shown him not only the structure of the world, but the architecture of the soul. He was no longer just a prince. He was a seeker, an observer, a man who had glimpsed the eternal through the lens of philosophy. The boy who once asked, "What makes a life worthy of remembrance?" now carried the tools to answer that question, not for himself alone, but for all of humanity. The sun had not yet risen in the morning. Alexander sat alone beneath the statue of Heracles in the palace courtyard. The stone figure loomed above him, chiseled in divine strength and immortalized in triumph. But Alexander wasn't studying its muscles or pose. He was staring into the eyes, cold, silent, eternal. Was he ever afraid? Alexander whispered. No answer came, of course. Only the soft rustle of the wind through the olive trees. But in his heart, Alexander knew the answer. Even gods in human form must feel the tremors of uncertainty, because he, Alexander, felt them constantly. He was 15 now, tall, lean, and sharp-eyed. His presence carried weight in the royal court, yet his soul was in turmoil. The world expected him to rise, to lead, to conquer not just lands but legends. And though he had been trained by philosophers and sculpted by kings, he still hadn't answered the most important question. Who was he? Despite the image that many held of Alexander, the prodigy, the philosopher king, the chosen son of fate, he wrestled with a constant, burning uncertainty. Am I truly destined for greatness? Or am I simply pretending to be someone they already believe in? At court, he wore the robes of royalty and spoke with the precision of a seasoned orator. But in private, he'd often retreat into solitude, standing before mirrors or pacing gardens, asking questions he couldn't always answer. His journals during this period, rarely quoted but profoundly revealing, tell of a boy becoming a man through fire, not of battle, but of identity. I see in myself 1,000 faces, son, student, heir, dreamer, wanderer. Which of these is true? Or am I all, and none at once? He longed to be known, not merely recognized by others, but truly understood by himself. And perhaps the only person who came close to piercing his soul was Hephaestion. Their bond had grown since childhood, but now it deepened into something sacred. Hephaestion was not merely a companion. He was a mirror, reflecting Alexander's unspoken doubts and hidden truths. Unlike the courtiers, Hephaestion did not flatter him. He questioned, challenged, teased, and listened. One day, as they rode through the hills of Macedonia, far from the noise of the palace, Alexander confessed, "Sometimes I feel like a shadow pretending to be light." Hephaestion turned in his saddle and replied, "Even a shadow proves there is light behind it." That line stuck with Alexander more than any poem or prayer. The two would sit for hours under starlit skies, speaking of life, fate, and the soul. While Aristotle had sharpened Alexander's mind, Hephaestion nurtured his heart. He reminded Alexander that strength wasn't found only in knowledge or command, but in vulnerability, in the courage to feel deeply without apology. And Alexander did feel deeply. Perhaps too much. He cried openly when reading tragic plays. He mourned animals that died in the wild. He wept at sunsets, calling them wounds in the sky too beautiful to bear. And yet, he was terrified of this sensitivity. He worried that it made him weak, that showing too much feeling would strip him of the invincible image others projected onto him. He began to create masks, one for the court, one for his father, one for his friends. But the more masks he wore, the more he began to forget his own face. Then came an event that would shake his soul like an earthquake. At 16, while his father was away attending diplomatic matters, Alexander was given temporary governance of Macedon. It was his first official duty of power. The court cheered, his tutors bowed, and his advisors watched with interest. But Alexander felt no pride, only pressure. Each decision he made, however small, was dissected, criticized, and recorded. When he reformed a tax to ease the burden on a poor village, nobles scoffed. When he ordered new wells to be built, some called it sentimental nonsense. Late one evening, he collapsed in his chamber, not from exhaustion, but from self-doubt. "I am not a king," he whispered. "I am a boy wearing a crown made of expectation." In the days that followed, he avoided mirrors altogether. He could not look at himself without feeling the weight of inherited dreams. And then, as if guided by fate, a letter arrived. It was from Aristotle. It read, "Remember, Alexander, identity is not discovered. It is forged. You are not the flame. You are the flint. And only through pressure, through striking against the world, will your spark be born." Alexander clutched the letter and felt something shift within, a quiet, defiant glow. He began journaling again, not just thoughts but intentions. He wrote lists of virtues he wanted to embody: integrity, curiosity, empathy, temperance. He observed his moods, studied his flaws, and tracked his habits. He began to forge his identity, not from the expectations of others, but from his own vision. He also started seeking out conversations with people outside the court, merchants, poets, shepherds, even beggars. He asked them what they feared, what they loved, what they dreamed of. He wanted to understand humanity not from scrolls, but from souls. He once sat for hours beside an old blind man in the marketplace, asking how he saw the world without sight. "I see it through memory," the man said, "and through voices like yours." Alexander bowed his head and replied, "Then I shall speak in a way worth remembering." But even as his inner life matured, the cracks in his outer world deepened. His relationship with his father became increasingly strained. Philip, now fully engulfed in his political conquests, viewed Alexander's sensitivity and self-reflection as weakness. The king wanted action, decisiveness, control. "You think too much," Philip once barked during a council meeting. "And you feel too little," Alexander replied coldly. They were fire and stone, powerful but incompatible. And though Alexander never stopped respecting his father's achievements, he began to doubt the path Philip wanted for him. It was around this time that Alexander began developing his own vision of leadership, one grounded not merely in domination, but in connection. He imagined a world where rulers were guardians, not overlords, where wisdom walked hand in hand with strength, where foreign cultures were not enemies to subdue, but mysteries to learn from. He began to see unity not as control, but as understanding. This radical vision, though still embryonic, began shaping his thoughts, his dreams, and his sense of self. He no longer wanted to merely fill the throne of Macedon. He wanted to become something larger than a king, a bridge between people, philosophies, and generations. He often wrote of this new identity in his journal, under a single word: cosmopolites, a citizen of the world. And yet, even as his spirit soared, his personal challenges did not ease. He battled the growing realization that he could never fully belong, not to one people, one idea, or one home. He was beginning to see himself as rootless, a soul meant to walk beyond borders. And this realization, though empowering, was also deeply lonely. He confided in Hephaestion one night, "I feel like I'm walking towards something vast, but the farther I go, the fewer people can walk beside me." Hephaestion replied, "Then I will walk behind you, and when you turn around, I'll still be there." That vow would stay with Alexander for the rest of his life. It reminded him that no matter how vast his vision, he must never lose touch with the human pulse, the simple, sacred connections that ground even the greatest of legends. By 17, Alexander was no longer a boy, but he was not yet a man either. He was a seeker standing at the edge of transformation. The masks he once wore were falling away, and a new face, his true face, was beginning to emerge. He was learning to carry both strength and sorrow, ambition and humility, fire and tenderness. He was beginning to see that greatness was not forged in the eyes of others, but in the quiet choices one makes when no one is watching. He had not yet stepped onto the stage of the world, but already he had begun the most difficult conquest of all, the conquest of the self. The world teaches its hardest lessons in silence, not through sudden catastrophe, but through the slow erosion of certainty, of trust, of the invisible structures that hold a soul upright. For Alexander, that slow corrosion began at 17. He stood then at the precipice of power, not yet king, but treated by many as more than a prince. His intellect, charm, and vision had won the admiration of philosophers and foreign dignitaries alike. In public, his steps echoed with confidence. But behind the palace walls of Pella, within the gilded chambers and secret corridors, he was learning a bitter truth. Greatness attracts shadows. The father in the distance. Philip II had grown colder. No longer a young king building a nation from warring tribes. He was now a hardened ruler whose mind was a web of ambition. He had dreams, not just for Macedon, but for himself. Alexander, in turn, was becoming more independent, more idealistic, and in Philip's eyes, more difficult. Their conversations were now calculated dances. When once they had argued with passion, now they communicated in measured silence, short phrases, or public exchanges, disguised as fatherly guidance. Alexander noticed the change and wrote in his journal, "I am a tree growing beside another. We once reached toward the sky together, but now his roots strangle mine in the soil." The tension deepened when Philip married Cleopatra Eurydice, a young Macedonian noblewoman. Unlike Olympias, Cleopatra was of native blood, and her union with Philip was more than romantic, it was political. It signaled a shift in allegiance, a potential threat to Alexander's position as heir. Worse still, at the wedding banquet, one of Cleopatra's uncles, Autolus, rose drunkenly, and proposed a toast. May the union bless us with a pure Macedonian heir to the throne. The room froze. Alexander's eyes locked with his father's. Olympias left in silence. Alexander stood, and without hesitation, hurled his goblet at Attilus's face, drawing blood. He turned to Philip and hissed, "Am I now a bastard in your house?" Philip, furious and intoxicated, attempted to rise and strike him, but stumbled, collapsing before the entire court. The moment burned itself into the walls. To many, it was a moment of shame. To Alexander, it was a revelation. His lineage, his purpose, even his legitimacy, were all now questioned. That night, he left the palace. The exile and the fire within. For months, Alexander lived away from Pella. Some say he traveled to Illyria, others that he wandered through Epirus. What mattered more than where he went was who he became during that time. He was still a teenager, but life was now forcing him to grow alone, without his father's shelter, without his mother's fierce counsel, without even the steady voice of Aristotle, who had since returned to Athens. He wandered with only a few companions, Hephaestion among them, and immersed himself in philosophy, observation, and hard introspection. He spoke with farmers, slept in shepherds' huts, and spent long nights staring at the stars. He wrote, "I see now that a prince can lose everything but his soul. And yet the soul is the only thing no one can take, unless he gives it away." He began to see suffering, not as punishment, but as purification. That these trials, these betrayals, this exile, were not signs of failure, but flames shaping the metal of his spirit. He also began to reflect deeply on power. Watching village elders govern with fairness, witnessing the pain of people neglected by the aristocracy, he started forming a new definition of leadership, not as dominance, but as service rooted in insight. The Mother and the Serpent. During his exile, letters from Olympias began arriving. Their tone was emotional, urgent, and filled with warnings. "You are surrounded by serpents, my son. Even your father now hears the hiss of those who want you erased." She believed Cleopatra's family was plotting to secure their own bloodlines, rise to the throne, and Alexander's fall. Olympias, ever mystical, often infused her messages with symbolic warnings, visions of crows, dreams of lions surrounded by jackals. To many, she was mad. To Alexander, she was a prophetess. And yet, her fire began to burden him. She wanted vengeance, influence, and a son who would rule as she saw fit. Alexander began to question not only his father, but now his mother as well. "I am their legacy," he once wrote, "but I am not their prisoner." This realization, that even love could become a form of control, was one of the hardest truths he had to face. When Alexander finally returned to the palace, things had changed. Philip welcomed him publicly, as though nothing had happened, but the court was colder, more suspicious. Cleopatra now walked the halls like a queen. Attalus had grown in influence. Whispers filled the air like smoke. And yet, Alexander returned not as a boy, but as a man who had stared into his own abyss and returned not broken, but clarified. He no longer argued openly with Philip. Instead, he observed. He listened. He planned. He focused on his studies, spent more time with foreign envoys, and trained his body and mind with renewed discipline. He became polite to his enemies, warm with the poor, and distant with those who sought to manipulate him. The transformation was quiet but unmistakable. He wrote, "They wanted me to be heir to a throne. I now seek to be heir to truth." It was during this time that Alexander faced his first true loss, one that did not affect his status or position, but his heart. His beloved tutor Lysimachus, the gentle man who had once read Homer to him and compared him to Achilles, passed away in his sleep. The news came one morning, carried by a breathless servant. Alexander left the palace silently. He walked to a quiet grove and wept under a cypress tree, not with the wild sorrow of youth, but with the deep, enduring ache of becoming aware of mortality. He wrote nothing for days. When he finally did, his journal read only, "What is the point of wisdom if it cannot stop death?" This question marked a turning point in his life. He began to seek not just knowledge, but immortality, not for his body, but for his influence. If death came for all, then the only antidote was to live so fully, so impactfully, that the memory of one's life became a kind of permanence. Meanwhile, the politics of the palace grew darker. Alexander learned, through loyal informants, that certain nobles were beginning to court Cleopatra's child, a daughter, as a future royal figurehead. If she had a son, the threat to Alexander's claim would become dangerous. He also discovered that bribes were being passed through minor advisors, that some former allies had begun shifting allegiance in quiet whispers and closed rooms. This web of betrayal forced Alexander to hone a new skill, discernment. He could no longer trust simply. He had to observe faces, analyze words, detect lies wrapped in flattery. His sense of truth sharpened. He became more enigmatic, more inward. While others aged into confidence, Alexander aged into watchful precision. On his 18th birthday, a mysterious old priest arrived from the oracle of Dion. He brought no gifts, only a cryptic message. The flame that endures must pass through 7 veils: the veil of blood, the veil of silence, the veil of madness, the veil of power, the veil of truth, the veil of dust, and finally, the veil of God. Alexander dismissed the man publicly, but kept the words in his heart. He wrote, "Perhaps I am not becoming a king at all. Perhaps I am being stripped of all that is false, until what remains is what I truly am." By 19, Alexander was no longer simply the boy trained by Aristotle, or the heir of Philip. He was something else, a flame surviving winds, learning to burn without consuming. He had faced the loss of trust, of certainty, of innocence. He had learned that even love can manipulate, that greatness breeds enemies, that destiny cannot be inherited. It must be earned, endured, and chosen daily. His legend had not begun in conquest or crowns. It had begun in silence, in moments no one saw, in grief, in exile, in betrayal, in the forging of a self that no longer needed permission to exist. In the eyes of others, he was still a prince, but in the mirror of his soul, he had become a pilgrim on the path to immortality. It is easy to rule with force. It is much harder to rule with vision, but the hardest of all is to rule oneself. By the age of 20, Alexander was no longer merely a shadow of his father. He had become a figure of contradiction, a man of piercing intelligence and deep emotion, of regal pride and monk-like humility. Though the crown would eventually fall to him, his rule did not begin with a coronation, but in how he governed his own heart. The journey of becoming a true ruler, for Alexander, was not about lands or titles. It was about forging an inner kingdom, one that could withstand flattery, betrayal, temptation, and loneliness. It was about mastering not the world, but himself. Alexander began rising before the sun. While others in the palace still slept behind velvet curtains, he would be at the edge of the river, barefoot, eyes closed, letting the cool wind wrap around him like a teacher. He had developed morning rituals, stillness, reflection, movement. Some days, he would run along the forest trails until his breath became rhythm. Other days, he would sit on a stone bench near the palace gardens and read from scrolls. Homer, Heraclitus, Zeno, texts that didn't just inform but transformed. He once remarked to Hephaestion, his closest companion, "What we conquer out there matters little if we are slaves in here." And indeed, the palace was filled with men who ruled armies, but were conquered by their own arrogance, fear, or indulgence. Alexander was determined to be different. Unlike many nobles, Alexander did not shut himself away from the voices of the poor or the servants. He would sit with stable boys and kitchen workers, asking them about their lives, their hopes, their troubles. He listened to an old woman who lost 3 sons to the sea. He listened to a blind poet who sang of the stars. He listened to a child who dreamed of riding horses over mountains. These conversations shaped his understanding of leadership. To him, a ruler was not a man seated above others, but a man who saw all others as parts of himself. He began writing letters to himself, calling them notes to the future king. In one he wrote, "Let every title remind me. I am not above them. I am entrusted with them." This sense of duty, born from empathy, would later shape every decision he made, not only in court, but in how he treated strangers, foreigners, prisoners, and friends. It was during this chapter of life that Alexander faced one of his most intimate challenges, the seduction of luxury and indulgence. With rising status came attention, banquets in his honor, dancers gifted by nobles, gold and wine flowing in his name. He was young, admired, and powerful. He could have surrendered easily to excess, but something in him resisted. One evening, after a long feast, when courtiers whispered of him becoming the next god king, he left the hall and walked alone through the vineyards. He later wrote, "Pleasure is a guest that stays too long. At first, it brings music, but soon it clutters the soul." Alexander made an unusual decision. He began fasting periodically and abstaining from alcohol for long stretches. He allowed himself only one robe. He refused to sleep on feather beds. Servants whispered that he was mad, but those closest to him saw a young man building a fortress within, not to shut the world out, but to keep his purpose from being diluted by comfort. Alexander had begun speaking to himself, openly, sometimes aloud, not from vanity, but from a strange, pressing need for inner truth. Each morning, after washing his face, he would look into the mirror and ask a question. What tempts you today? What are you afraid of? Whom have you failed? Who do you pretend to be? These were not rhetorical. He demanded answers. And if no answers came, he would wait. In these silent interrogations, Alexander began to discover the subtle masks he wore, the need to impress, the fear of being ordinary, the hunger for eternal admiration. "We are many people within," he wrote, "but the one who faces the mirror and tells the truth, that is the ruler." He became obsessed with aligning his outer life with his inner code, seeing any gap between the two as weakness. During this period of self-mastery, Alexander's vision for the world also began to form, not merely as a place to be ruled, but a tapestry to be woven together. He began speaking about strange ideas, a world where East and West are not enemies, but partners, a realm where knowledge from all cultures is gathered and shared, a society where merit, not just bloodline, earns respect. To some nobles, this sounded ridiculous. To others, it sounded dangerous. One advisor told him, "The world does not want unity. It wants control." To which Alexander replied, "Then let the world be wrong until it learns." He began inviting scholars from distant lands, holding salons where mathematics, medicine, language, and poetry were discussed, not for politics, but for expansion of the soul. Even in youth, he understood that empires of the mind outlast those of stone. If Alexander had one true equal, it was Hephaestion. Their bond was deep, not just in affection, but in mutual reflection. They challenged each other, corrected each other, and more importantly, kept each other honest. Hephaestion was the only one allowed to speak to Alexander without fear, without flattery. One night, after a tense debate over a court decision, Hephaestion told him bluntly, "You see farther than most, Alexander, but sometimes you forget those walking behind you may trip trying to keep up." It was said not in arrogance, but love, and Alexander took it seriously. He wrote the next day, "The higher I rise, the more I need those who tether me to the ground." Their friendship was a gift and a compass. While others tried to mold Alexander into a myth, Hephaestion reminded him to remain human. The encounter with the sage. One autumn morning, Alexander received word of an old hermit living in the caves beyond the mountain pass. Curious, he traveled alone to meet him. The man was blind, ragged, and almost skeletal, but his voice was clear. They spoke for hours. Alexander asked, "What is the purpose of power?" The sage replied, "To lift the weight of suffering from others." Alexander asked, "And what is the danger of greatness?" The sage whispered, "You begin to believe you are more than human, and less than human." Before leaving, Alexander bowed, a gesture rare from a prince, and the old man touched his forehead. "You seek eternity," he said. "But first, master presence." That night, Alexander wrote no journal. He sat in silence, feeling the truth settle in him like snow. By now, Alexander had begun creating what he called his inner court, not of advisors or warriors, but principles. He wrote them on parchment and kept them hidden. Know thyself before judging others. Listen longer than you speak. Power is borrowed from the people. Luxury weakens the purpose. Truth is a better crown than flattery. Let no day pass without learning. Fear not death, but the life unlived. These were not laws for others. These were laws for himself. And he reviewed them each morning, like a king checking his armor before riding out, except this armor was made of soul. By his early 20s, Alexander had undergone more than most do in a lifetime, not in battlefields, but in the chambers of self-awareness. He had turned pain into purpose, exile into introspection, temptation into temperance. He had begun building an empire that few saw, not of stone, but of spirit, ethics, and vision. And it was in this private realm, long before history etched his name in gold, that Alexander earned the title we still whisper centuries later, legend. Not because he ruled, but because he ruled himself. It was in the silent hours before dawn, when most of the world was still wrapped in sleep, that Alexander often experienced something he could not explain. Not thoughts, not dreams, but whispers. They came like faint winds from another world, brushing the edges of his soul, voices without mouths, messages without language. He did not know if they came from gods, his ancestors, or simply his own unraveling mind. But what he did know was this: something was calling him, not toward glory, not toward conquest, but toward understanding his place in the great wheel of time. One autumn evening, as Alexander sat alone on a hill overlooking the city, a streak of burning silver carved itself across the sky. A comet, luminous and ominous. The air changed. Birds fell silent. The dogs in the nearby village howled, and old women clutched their necklaces, muttering prayers. To the common folk, it was a bad omen. To the priests, it was a sign of divine transition. But to Alexander, it felt like a summons, a celestial reminder that he was not just flesh and blood, but perhaps something more. Later that night, he wrote in his journal, "I am haunted by the idea that I was not born, but placed, that my life is not my own, but borrowed from the hands of fate." He didn't know whether that made him powerful or imprisoned. Not long after, Alexander visited a secluded temple known only to a few. It was hidden in the cliffs, guarded not by soldiers, but by silence. The priestess there was said to see without eyes, a blind seer whose visions were like fire. She did not greet him with titles. She did not kneel. Instead, she whispered as he entered, "You've arrived late. The gods have waited." Alexander was unnerved, but he sat. What followed was not a prophecy, but a mirror made of words. You carry the seeds of 10 lifetimes, yet you cannot even water one without cracking the vessel. You fear becoming myth more than becoming man. Your crown will feel heavier in solitude than in battle. She said nothing about his future, only truths he already sensed. And as he left, she placed a hand on his chest. Greatness is not given, it is survived. That phrase echoed in him for months. Not given, survived. Though Alexander revered many philosophers, it was the tale of Achilles that burrowed deepest into his soul. He read and reread the Iliad as if it were scripture. He even kept a copy beneath his pillow. But as he grew older, his obsession became more complex. At first, he admired Achilles' strength and speed, his glory and wrath. But then, he began to see Achilles' torment, his loneliness, his rage, his deep inner fracture. One night, Alexander confessed to Hephaestion. Achilles conquered the world, but not his grief. What use is glory if it burns your heart to ash? He realized that becoming a legend was not just about being remembered, it was about being remembered with peace. He didn't want his legacy to be made only of marble statues and battle hymns. He wanted it etched in something eternal. Wisdom, balance, the evolution of the human spirit. As his fame spread, Alexander began to notice an unsettling change in his mind. In the stillness, a voice would speak to him, one that sounded like himself, but older, more patient, more dangerous. It wasn't madness. It was something deeper. The voice would question him when he felt pride. Was that for them or for you? It would whisper when he was praised. Do you need their applause to exist? It would challenge him in moments of desire. Is this freedom or another chain? At first, he tried to drown it out, with study, with exercise, with action. But over time, he realized the voice wasn't his enemy. It was the part of him that still belonged to the infinite. The part that saw time as a circle, not a line. The part that knew things he hadn't yet learned. He began to refer to it in his journal as the silent guide. One day, while traveling through a distant village, Alexander met a child of no more than 12, who sat alone beneath a fig tree, drawing symbols in the dirt. The boy did not rise or bow. Alexander asked, "Why do you sit here alone?" The boy replied, "Because I know things no one else wants to hear." Intrigued, Alexander sat beside him. The boy spoke in riddles and paradoxes, in quiet wisdom that startled the soul. He said, "When you are no longer afraid of dying, you begin to fear living wrongly. Some men build mountains to climb. Others climb to realize the mountain was never there. You are not the storm, Alexander. You are the space it moves through." Alexander was quiet, moved, shaken. He tried to ask the boy his name, but the child stood, smiled faintly, and walked away, leaving behind only his drawings in the dust. One morning, a servant named Dion, who had tended Alexander's robes since childhood, passed away quietly in his sleep. No grand eulogy, no procession. Just the end of a simple life. Alexander insisted on preparing the man's burial himself. He cleaned the body. He sewed the shroud. He dug the grave. And after the burial, he sat beside it until dusk. When Hephaestion found him, he asked why Alexander had done all this. Alexander replied, "Because for once, I wanted to do something without power watching me. Something simply human." That evening, he looked into his mirror again and said aloud, "You will die too, Alexander. Perhaps sooner than you think. So ask yourself each day, if today were the last, would you still wear that crown? Would you still seek the stars? Would you still be proud of the man you've become?" Alexander began noticing the movements of animals more carefully. When a hawk circled him 3 times before vanishing into the sun, he took it as a message of divine approval. When a white lion cub was found near his camp, he refused to cage it. "It came to remind me," he said, "that nature bows to no man." He once dreamed of a turtle crawling toward a mountain, carrying a flame on its back. When he described it to a sage, the man said, "That is you, slow, stubborn, sacred, carrying fire not to burn, but to illuminate." Whether these were real messages or his mind seeking patterns didn't matter. What mattered was what they awakened inside him, a feeling that he was woven into something larger than history. As time passed, Alexander began to feel a strange pressure, not from enemies or politics, but from within. It was the weight of becoming. The more people believed in him, the harder it became to remain true to himself. Every gesture was watched, every word repeated, every flaw magnified. He feared becoming a statue while still alive, admired, unchanging, and utterly alone. In one of his final journal entries from this phase, he wrote, "I do not fear dying forgotten. I fear dying remembered as someone I never truly was." This was the paradox of his life. He wanted to matter, but only if it was real. Not for illusion, not for legend, but for the truth of what he was becoming. Not a god, not a king, but a man deeply, fiercely awake. Alexander did not find peace easily. He was torn between fate and freedom, myth and man, silence and glory. But in those long walks under the stars, in those whispered prayers to know God in particular, in those trembling conversations with himself, he touched something divine. And not the divine of thrones or temples. The divine of being fully present, fully questioning, fully alive. He began to understand that the whispers, the omens, the dreams, they weren't messages from outside. They were echoes from the deepest parts of himself, reminding him of what he truly was. A bridge between earth and sky. A man who bore the fire of destiny without letting it consume him. A soul that chose to grow, even when it meant tearing itself open. And that was why Alexander was becoming a legend. Not for what he conquered, but for what he refused to let conquer him. Part 7. The Immortal Echo. Why Alexander became a legend. It is said that every man is given 2 lives. The second begins the moment he realizes he only has one. For Alexander, that realization did not strike like lightning. It arrived like dawnlight through a half-closed curtain, slow, soft, and soul-wrenching. It crept in while he sat alone with his thoughts, surrounded by gold, attendants, and the silent applause of a world that had already begun carving his image into stone. He had achieved more than anyone ever dared to dream. And yet, a gnawing question followed him like a shadow that stretched longer the higher he rose. Was this what I was meant to become? The weight of praise? He was only in his 30s, and already people whispered his name beside gods and constellations. They called him the son of Zeus, the new Achilles, the living oracle. But Alexander had learned the bitter truth. Praise is sweet poison. It lifts you even as it hollows you out. He saw men change in his presence, friends turning into flatterers, truth bending into applause, silence masquerading as respect. Even those closest to him began to hesitate before speaking freely, afraid that their honesty might offend the divine being they had helped build. And so, the more they revered him, the more isolated he became. In his journal, he once scrawled furiously, "They do not love me. They love what I represent." He had become a myth while still alive, and it terrified him. Letters to no one. During his final years, Alexander began writing strange letters, not to kings, not to philosophers, but to the unborn. He called these his letters to no one. He buried them in clay jars, sealed with wax, and hid them in different corners of the lands he passed through. None were addressed. None were signed. They were simply thoughts meant for whoever might find them in another age. In one letter, he wrote, "You will hear of me as a conqueror, a man who moved the world. But know this, my greatest victories were not over lands, but over the monsters within myself." Another read, "If you ever rise to greatness, remember to touch the earth often. Smell the soil. Weep without shame. And never, ever forget the feeling of being just a boy with questions." He did not write these to be remembered. He wrote them because he could no longer speak them aloud. The final vision. In his last weeks, Alexander often slipped into feverish dreams. Some were delirium. Some, perhaps, were visions. In one, he stood before a massive mirror that showed not his reflection, but the faces of countless people, children, sages, strangers, lovers, enemies. Each face stared at him, silent and expectant. Then the mirror cracked, not from his touch, but from the weight of being seen by too many eyes at once. He awoke with tears on his face. That morning, he said to Hephaestion, "I think I was never meant to be one man. I was always meant to be a question in the minds of others." He began to accept that maybe he was not a god, maybe not even a king. Maybe he was simply a symbol of how far a soul could stretch when it refused to be ordinary. The echo that never ends. In the days following his death, legends grew like vines. Some said he never died at all, that he ascended into the sky, his body carried by fire-breathing serpents. Others claimed he still walked the earth, disguised as a beggar or a traveler, whispering wisdom to those who dared to listen. But the truest echo was not in those myths. It was in the questions he left behind. Can one man carry a dream too vast for his own time? Is it possible to seek greatness and still remain human? How much of who we are is shaped by the eyes that see us? Generations of rulers tried to mimic him. Poets tried to capture him. Historians tried to define him, but none succeeded. Why? Because Alexander was not just a man. He was a riddle written in fire. The world remembers Alexander for how far he went. But what they often forget is how deeply he searched within. Yes, he crossed mountains, deserts, rivers, and oceans. But more courageously, he crossed through. His father's legacy without letting it devour him. His own pride without letting it harden him. The illusion of immortality without letting it blind him. He was born into greatness, but he earned his legend through introspection, humility, and a restless hunger for truth. He asked questions emperors were too proud to ask. He wept when no one was watching. He stood before the universe, not as a king, but as a student. And that is why he lives on. Legends are not born from perfection. They are born from flawed souls who dared to go further, inside and out, than anyone else. Alexander wasn't the legend because he conquered. He became the legend because he listened to the winds when others only heard silence, sought wisdom when others only sought applause, faced the shadow in the mirror when others turned away. He became a mirror to humanity, showing us what we might become if we refuse to settle for easy answers. And perhaps that's what a legend truly is. Not a man who did the impossible, but a man who made others believe they could too. In every age, people look to the past for models, myths, warnings. Some see in Alexander the arrogance of empire. Others see the tragedy of a man crushed by his own dream. But those who look closely, honestly, without agenda, they see something else. They see a boy who read old poems by candlelight, dreaming not of power, but of meaning. They see a man who gave away his sleep, his safety, his soul in pursuit of answers that still elude us today. And they see in him the ancient, flickering light of someone who tried, truly tried, to become more than the sum of his time. Not for fame, not for legacy, but because he couldn't bear to remain small. If Alexander were alive today, and you asked him, "Do you believe you became a legend?" He might pause. He might smile, half broken, half proud. And he might reply, "No, but I became someone who refused to stop growing." And that, perhaps, is the seed from which legends grow.